it's not meant for you to be brief. So add enough context so that I understand what you're talking about in it. So.
Okay. And then also, she was wondering if you want us to fill out every fragment of the heart.
Well, that would be preferred. I mean, it's as strange as it sounds. It's your heart, so you can do with it what you want. But yeah, I mean, how you want to organize it, how you want to do it is entirely up to you. So you guys can do it how you want, how you see fit. So she doesn't want, if people don't see a reason for that, then fine, don't. I mean, the bigger project, or the more important one is the self-study. So that's the more important one. Yeah, Jade.
And just to clarify, it's how we see ourselves and then how others see us for the heart.
Right, the outside and inside view. So the outside is what other people see, the inside is what you see. So that's how that was intended. So, any other questions or anything? Yeah, you're on a roll.
For the outside, are we supposed to be writing about like how we perceive others see us?
Well, either way, I think it would probably be more revealing if you were to ask people to fill it in. But I mean, generally I think people being under the gun with the end of the semester probably end up making the outside how they perceive other people seeing them. So I think if you, to some degree, if you wanted to get the most benefit out of it, you'd show people what it is and say, what do you think is on here? Or what do I show? And we probably find that out much more that way. So, yeah. Any other questions? I'll wait for one more from Jade to come up. No, go ahead, Quincy.
The other portion, it's not the hearts. The other one, what is it called again?
It's the worksheet.
Yeah, the worksheet.
Yeah.
Is it okay if we just download that as like a Word docs and then fill in the rest of the sentences?
I mean, you can do that. I'm not sure that it would maintain its formatting very well if you did that. Okay. I mean, I think, if you have Acrobat Reader, you could probably fill it in with the tools that Acrobat Reader gives you and do it that way, and then save it as another document and then upload it into Blackboard. You could do it that way. I think as you guys have found out, the formatting gets pretty jacked up when you go to download something from Blackboard. So, and that would probably be true, that it's a PDF document, which makes it a lot easier really to fill it in. So, you could always do it that way. So either one's fine. Anything else? All right, well, this has been quite a semester. This is your last lecture. What I want to spend some time looking at is what I'm referring to as living free. We have been looking at the personal characteristics of pure glass people. And then last time we looked at the interpersonal characteristics, like relationally, how do they tend to relate? And this last one also fits into that characteristic of the idea of living free. Most of the time, the challenge we have, even as we talk about all of the stuff that we have over the course of the semester, is kind of a repeat. I mean, we were talking about old country, new country, the tendency for us to go from old to new, and then new back, and that's a really normal part of the process of learning how to live free. And that's kind of what I wanted to land on for one last time, is to paint this picture of what it looks like. And hopefully this brings together all that we've talked about all semester. Some things in here you'll hear that are familiar because they're applied in the sense of, what's the landscape of the new country really look like? Now, I did a real brief thing of that last time, but I want to talk a little bit about freedom, because it probably is the hallmark characteristic pure glass is freedom. You can freely see in. Now that doesn't mean without blinds or anything. You guys got all that. We've talked about that. That's kind of what I have for you. I may or may not. I really have no idea whether this is going to fill the hour or not. This is my best guess. You guys have been in a position where we've been staying on schedule relatively well. So now the last class you had was really new material, not new to me, but new material for students to hear. And this is another installment of that, really, of so what, now what? What kinds of things do I actually do? So with that, let me pray real quick, and then we'll get into this. Father, guide our time, guide our hearts into what you have for us today in this time that we share one last time all together as a class. I pray that you will guide that process and continue the process beyond even this semester, as some people are graduating and moving out into the world and relationships, and you've armed us and trained us even within this semester and other semesters how to go about doing that and what to do in healthy sort of ways. And that I pray that learning would just continue. Not that it's once and done for a class like this, or even a college career. It's never once and done. It's always continued learning thereafter. So I pray that you'll guide us into that launch point and what you have for us and your Holy Spirit has for us over this next hour or so. Thank you for your love. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so one of the things that it occurs to me is this idea of living free, and one of the things that I want to highlight for you is laid into even our conversation is being free from something versus being free to do something. And that's the distinction I want to try to make as we're talking about this, because generally speaking, when we think of freedom, a lot of times what we think of is the freedom from something, whether that's authority or constraints or expectations or whatever the freedom from piece is. But I also want to look at the idea of being free to do certain things, to accomplish certain things, to cultivate certain things, because we are free to do that. Now, granted, we don't have absolute freedom. We're limited agents. We have a certain area of influence that we have the freedom to operate within, but there are constraints and there are limits to that, and at some level we know that living freely without constraints, without responsibility, is little more than living with license to do whatever I want. That's not freedom at all, actually, because of usually the negative consequences that come from actually doing it that way. So the difference between these two things are very important to understand. And what I want to focus on first is this idea of freedom from. Being free from responsibility or freedom from authority or freedom from whatever usually requires some kind of external intervention. That something from outside creates this situation where I want to get away from it. I want to be free of it. And it also requires some external source. And so what we begin to see when we're talking about freedom from is that it's built off of some reaction to, some interaction with something external to me. And so as a general rule, a lot of the freedom that we're talking about in terms of being free from something is conferred on whomever that might be. And ultimately, it's given on the basis of the power of the person giving that freedom. And actually, this is a much larger debate, even in our culture today, about where do rights come from, for example. We have liberties, we have freedom to do whatever we want, and including and up to saying things that offend people. But if we say, I want to be free from any consequences of saying something harmful or offensive to somebody, that's not really freedom. It's just license to do whatever I want. Ultimately, even in our culture, we don't have absolute freedoms. And the things that are marked out for us, even in the founding of our country, was that we have rights. It's not a matter of we're given rights, we have rights. And that same thing is true with freedom. So the problem here is it defines freedom in terms of some other thing outside of me. And a lot of times we'll hear this in our conversations about whatever the external source is or external intervention or whatever that might be. And we talk about, I want to be free from this. I want to be free from the deadlines and schedules of school, or I want to be free from whatever. And generally, we replace it with something most of the time. So freedom from is an important distinction to keep in mind. When we get to freedom to, then we get to, it's based on my personal power and agency. And when I say personal power, I'm not talking about controlling anybody. I'm talking about taking responsibility, taking the power that's rightfully mine to care for and relate to other people based on me. So my personal power and agency is always about the ability to have impact. I am an agent of change within the context in which I operate in the relationships I have with people. And so it starts with my personal power, which I have. It's also based on choice. It's not based on compulsion or obligation. It is based on choice. So being free to, I'm free to choose. I'm free to choose what I say, how I behave, what I do, how I spend my time, who I spend my time with. All of those things are based on choice. Ultimately, my choice is informed by the level of awareness I have regarding my own personal needs. And that's usually what drives along our choices, is what I need and how I need it and the nature of my needs. So ultimately, this idea of being free to do X, Y, or Z has to be claimed. And in a lot of cases, as I've spent time talking with people over the years, it seems like I'm constantly reminding them of the freedom they have to do something differently. And in a lot of cases, dramatic things happen, not with, huge paradigm shifts in somebody's thinking, but just in very small shifts in thinking. Because it sets a different course, a slightly different course, that over the course of time, it ends up being a dramatically different course. So we oftentimes lose sight of the freedom that is ours to have, even in our relationships. And the thing that tends to connect us to another person are the things that we want from that other person, and then we start giving away our freedom rather than taking what's rightfully mine. So the potential problem, as I've already stated, is being free to do whatever, is that it can turn into license. I can do whatever I want, and I don't really want to have to suffer consequences or responsibility or anything that goes ultimately along with that. So some keys I want to highlight for you. And again, this lecture is bringing together all of the things that we've talked about. So I'm not going into huge detail. I did that over the semester. But the first key is all about acceptance. And acceptance doesn't mean saying what is okay. I had a friend of mine that told me about a book that I'm probably going to try to read over the Christmas break, and it's entitled Becoming Mrs. Lewis. And it's actually an account of C.S. Lewis's joy from her perspective as to what it was like to become the wife of C.S. Lewis. And he says something in there that I believe the author probably did enough research to have a verbatim quote to work off of, that Lewis basically said. He said, we tolerate what we must in order to continue to survive. And so that is acceptance. It is not resignation, but it is acceptance of the way things are. It doesn't come from anyone else. Oftentimes we calibrate whether or not what we're doing is right or wrong based on other people's reaction to us. And then we accept that what we're doing is okay. Ultimately, it comes from living life as it is, not as I would have it to be, or not as it should be. And that too is expectations, or that too is acceptance. The key to grace is acceptance. It always will be. So when we were talking about, pursuing integration and accepting and receiving grace in the new country, it's accepting what is. And that's very much a part of that. So it's also living life with loose expectations, hanging on very loosely to things the way they are. One of the biggest conversations that I've had over the semester with the other section group has been living with people, mostly parents, living with parents as they are, not as we want them to be. And in a lot of cases, the keys to acceptance is accepting them as they are, which means I probably have to give up the image of what I want them to be, which I keep vying for. I keep trying to pull out of them somehow. And so living with loose expectations is living life open-handedly that says, I will accept what is as it is and live with it that way rather than the way it should be. So the whole essence of acceptance is rejecting resignation. And we have a constant phrase today that we say all the time, right? You know what it is. Yeah, it is what it is. And that is more of a statement of resignation than it is a statement of acceptance. And resignation gives away our personal power. Because so essentially I'm saying, I assent to that fact that I am helpless to do anything about this. Yes, as long as my focus is on external to me, that is true. But I maintain a lot of power when I start looking at how I frame it, how I understand it, the people that I interact with, and all the things that go along with it. So it continues to press for active choices throughout. It's not about what I can't change. It is about the one thing I can change, and that is my interior and how I deal with it. A lot of times shame is meant to change things, which it never does, when grace actually creates the space for us to do something really differently. So acceptance is the first key. The second one, which is right on the heels of the last one, is how do I go about handling expectations? The one thing that I would say, and the thing that I have said oftentimes, is a lot of times people use the word hope. Well, I certainly hope it turns out this way, or whatever, and oftentimes it's used to deny the reality of what really is. Well, I hope this time she'll be nice to me, or I hope this time we won't get in a fight, or I hope this time, and it's a denial of reality because the other person has made no changes whatsoever. So it doesn't use hope to deny reality, and it also means that I manage my expectations so that they're not geared to manage other people's behaviors, their expectations, their perceptions, how they react, what they feel, all the things that go along with that is handling expectations. See, if I start getting worried about how somebody else is going to feel, suddenly I am now responsible for that which I have no power over, which leads to resentment, which leads to anger, and that will start showing itself in the relationships themselves. So what that also means is that if I'm going to do these first two, then I've got to find a way to handle disappointment and disillusionment, and perhaps even experience grief at the loss of the idealized image that I have of this other person or the situation and how it will turn out or whatever. Because ultimately, the best expectations we have are built on what we know and are true rather than what we hope to be true. And that's where hope holds us hostage rather than actually giving us motivation to proceed. See, hope keeps moving us ahead, not based on, a wishful thinking, but based on something else in terms of what God has come alongside to provide me with to get through this situation, or whatever that might be. That I can have hope on, because God has already proven He will deliver on those hopes. But a lot of times our hopes, the word, is really expectations and demands that we have. So handling expectations. A third one is handling the truth about ourselves and others. And what this idea of living free is clarity versus shame. Shame always clouds the issue. It's not terribly creative. It's always about how bad I am, or something wrong or inherently wrong with me or whatever, versus clarity about what I can do and what I can't do under the circumstances, the nature of what's going on, the situation I'm in, all of those things. That's what clarity brings to us, so that what? We adjust our expectations. And the next word I use is the one that we hate the most, is adjusting my expectations downward. And that is anathema to us, because if I expect less, I'm sure I will get less. That may or may not be true. I may end up getting what is anyway. And so I have to live with the disillusionment and disappointment that comes along with this. Ultimately, the idea of choosing a relationship over getting things done is a part of dealing with ourselves, embracing heart development over image management. And that that always looks differently. Now that doesn't mean, don't read these as me saying, well, you just don't try. Because if I make that case and say, well, ultimately if I do these things then I won't achieve anything at all. No, that's really not true. Now, that's big T truth, that's not little t truth. It feels like I won't. But in a lot of cases, we are so hard driving most of the time that our downward adjusted expectations are miles above mediocrity. Miles above mediocrity. And so making the choices about dealing with grace to myself first, because it shows up in my relationships with others, and what I do with self-evaluation, and how I handle that. Yeah, Bree.
It made me think of like the phrase of like set your expectations low, or like expect the worst and be surprised at the best.
Yeah, right.
I don't know, that's something that my mom always told me, because I was the one to get my hopes up a lot, and then I'd always be let down by others and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? Because I feel like expecting the worst isn't the greatest, but it's still like not setting it.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's probably, like I talked about in class last hour, that's making an error in the opposite direction. Okay, so I have high expectations of idyllic life without whatever it is. And how do I guard against that? Well, catastrophe. I'll just calibrate against catastrophe. So if anything turns out reasonably well, I think that I'm in nirvana. Well, the harder route is to develop realistic expectations, which means it's going to be mixed with disappointment, but also satisfaction, both. And so, yes, that's a very common thing for people to say. I'll plan for the worst and hope for the best. And I have a particular phrase that I love to say about hope, which I won't because it probably rings in people's ears. But how I handle my self-evaluation has everything to do with my performance. What you will find in no matter what the discipline is, whether it's athletics or performance or talking in front of people or interacting with people or counseling or whatever the area is, the people that spend the most time in gracious, critical self-evaluation are the ones that become the best counselors, athletes, etc. Because grace allows them to tolerate mistakes and leverage those mistakes for better performance. But whether you're thinking of athletics or whether you're looking at even a counseling session is riddled with mistakes. And that really ends up not really being the point. The point is the level of connection that happens. So there's a misspoken word, there are things that are missed. When you go through graduate training, a lot of times you have to record your practicum sessions with people, and how many of us love to hear our own voices? You don't all have to clap. I know, I get it. But after going through enough training and counseling training, you start listening to what's going on in that session, and you get better because you see what you missed, and you say, okay, I want to clue into doing this a little bit differently next time. And guess who benefits? Your client does. The client always benefits when you get better. But if I say, this is the worst thing that could happen to me, I am a failed counselor, I can't do anything right, I don't know why I'm in this profession at all, I should just go work at a truck stop or whatever, how am I going to learn under those circumstances? It's really, really difficult to do that. Yes, Sid?
Yeah, kind of going off of Bree's question, that's something my dad says a lot too. If you expect the worst, then you'll be pleasantly surprised.
Right.
Do you think that could be like a cop-out of conflict or communication?
Say more, what do you mean?
Like, if you say, in this relationship, I'm just going to expect the worst, that seems like kind of a cop-out from like trying to make it better. Yeah, no, and I think going down that path, absolutely, I think that would be a good, not an effective thing at all, because I expect the worst and I get the worst, then what? And ultimately it's like, oh yeah, there it is. It was that way all the time. Now we get back into resignation because it's like, it's always going to be bad. Why bother doing anything about it at all? That's all it is ever going to be. So expecting the worst and then it is better is a crapshoot because you're not really doing anything to make it any better. You're just trying to adjust your expectations the way things are. So we have to find this way of threading this needle, I think, of living with life as it is. I don't have to like it, but I do have to embrace the reality of what it is, and also be the agent that I am to be able to manage my interior, my own expectations and all that kind of stuff, while at the same time influencing the outside environment to maybe be different. I've got that kind of agency. So it's all of the above kind of thing rather than either or. Most of these phrases are always an either or proposition most of the time. And that's not really how we live life effectively, is on the kind of the ends, the poles out here. So another one to talk about, handling boundaries with grace and truth. Now, again, like I said, warned you as we were going into this is going to sound strangely familiar, but living boundaries rather than communicating and hoping people cooperate. And I said it specifically the way that I did. I said it intentionally. Living boundaries, not living understanding boundaries or having a better understanding of boundaries or knowledge. No, I'm talking about how do we develop a mindset of living boundaries out. I've seen a lot of people, once they begin to grasp this idea of boundaries and everything, they spend a lot of time telling people about their boundaries and just say, well, if I tell them, then they'll abide by them. And that usually isn't the case. That's where disappointment ends up coming in. But living my boundaries, saying no when I mean no, and being gracious about it in terms of people not understanding and maybe not cooperating, and then adjusting my approach so that it is a little bit more specific. And ultimately, even as we talked about this, is that boundaries is also about self-care.
I can't know the self that I'm supposed to be caring for with the Proverbs 4:23 verse, take care of your heart, if I see that as being selfish. Now, when it comes to physiological needs, nobody will ever accuse us of being selfish. You know, you walk out of class, say, I'm hungry, I'm going to go get something to eat, and somebody doesn't look you in the eye and say, oh, stop being so selfish. No, we're not going to do that. But with emotional needs, we have a very different approach to that. Is that now you're being selfish. Why? Because if you own yourself and do this thing that I have up here in terms of self-care, that usually means saying no to certain things, and people aren't going to like it. We live in a world where we cooperate and collude with people to never say no, because we want to manage them. We don't want them to be upset. We don't want them to be disappointed. As a matter of fact, we don't want a lot of things for people more than they don't want to, because they have me in their life to do it for them. So nobody ends up taking responsibility for their own emotional state. So choosing to respond rather than reacting. A lot of times the only time we figure out how to do boundaries very well is when somebody's blowing through them. And like I said, not thinking boundaries rather than obsessing about it. It's not about what you know, it's what you can see as it occurs, and then readjusting it. You can always go back and readjust. You can always go back and readjust. A lot of times when we are poor at setting our boundaries, and then we begin to understand this concept and what we're talking about, we say, well, I can't go back and set them the right way because the person won't. Well, yeah, actually you can, but we don't want to face the consequences. That's why we don't have that's why we have such poor boundaries in the first place, is we don't want somebody to be angry if we have them. Another key is the cornerstone to living free is living forgivingly, without enabling bad behavior. Remember, the key element of the process of forgiveness is setting boundaries to protect myself, which takes us back to the issue I was talking about just a minute ago. But living forgivingly is the cornerstone to living free. Because living with expectations, living with reality as it is, oftentimes means I get a clearer view of the people that I probably need to forgive. And when I forgive them, I break that chain that binds me to them in terms of what I expect. The grudge was what we were talking about. And ultimately, figuring out how do I make this a lifestyle rather than a thing that I do. Because every relationship is going to have emotional bumps and bruises in it. People misstate things, or insensitive, just like I am. They do all of these things. Not everything is worthy of forgiveness. But things that threaten or rupture the relationship are worthy of that. And that's the one thing that we have to pay attention to and engage the process somehow, so that it allows me to be free. It doesn't mean not setting boundaries. That's why I say, living forgivingly without enabling bad behavior. Because a lot of times we think, well, if I forgive the person, they'll keep doing it and I'll just keep getting hurt. Well, that's not having any boundaries then. And we're not talking about that in terms of forgiveness. The one thing I'll point out to you is that Jesus lived forgivingly. His relationships, you can't tell me, you really would have a hard time convincing me that Peter didn't stick his foot in his mouth more than once in their 3 years of spending time together. And not everything was worthy of Jesus slapping him upside the head. And that's what I mean about living forgivingly. We have to differentiate between what we want for the person and what we want from the person. Because in a lot of cases, we want something from them and we've really never identified it. Usually what we want from them is retribution. That's a harsh way to put it, but we want them to apologize. We want them to recognize how they've hurt us. We want them to do all those things, but that is all parts of the links of the chain that we were talking about with forgiveness. So the living forgivingly The next one is striving to become comfortable with being different. Yes.
Sorry, really quick on the last point.
Yeah.
Does that play into like accountability too? Like what you want for the other person if you want something from them?
Right.
Like when approaching accountability kind of?
Say more, what do you mean?
Can there be like wrong intentions with that sometimes? Or do you think that people approach it wrong, like you want something for somebody?
In terms of what we want from somebody or what we want for them?
Yeah, I think.
Because when I want something for somebody, it doesn't prompt me to cross boundaries. I mean, I can have a desire for somebody to experience freedom or experience grace, but I can't want it more than they do. The minute I do, then I'm going to start wanting something from them, and that is find the grace that's yours, find forgiveness, etc. And as I said when we were talking about boundaries, the minute I want something for somebody more than they want that for themselves, I will cross boundaries.
So it's like a balance.
It is very much of a balance. I think the accountability piece is when I want somebody to be nice to me or approve of me or whatever, that's what I want from them. And so now I'm going to be in trouble because when they don't deliver, now am I forgiving them? Or is it, I really didn't adjust my expectations appropriately to the person as they are. So it can set the stage for being hurt and rupturing the relationship. And then obviously still I have forgiveness to do. But forgiveness is not only the process of setting me free, but forgiveness is also the process of giving me vision for how I handle relationships too. And so that's kind of what I meant. I think having good boundaries is accountability. Because when somebody says something that's offensive, having good boundaries is you look the person in the eye and say, ouch, that really hurt. That's accountability. Now, not you shouldn't do that. It's giving them the feedback they need to get about what they're doing. And that's accountability. Ultimately, I mean, when God holds us accountable, he does set a standard, but he also says, these are the consequences. And I think we do that for one another in the same sort of way. So you just walked into a minefield, Bree, because I have a really strong reaction, particularly in church, about accountability. Because it ends up being very strong-handed, beat the person up because they did something bad, they repent, and we go on about our business, which doesn't change anybody other than, fulfilling the power needs of the person who's doing it. And I don't think that that's accountability at all. It just is, how adept can the person be at telling a lie and getting away with it? I'm fairly skeptical about that, if you can't tell. So anyway, yeah, you stepped in something you didn't know you were going into. So I mentioned the striving to become comfortable with being different. Now, this idea of being comfortable with being different is part of what interferes with our true connection with other people. Because as I said, even when we're talking about conflict and being known and all of those things, is we believe that being the same as or similar to is the same as intimacy. So ultimately, living free allows me and actually prompts me to become more comfortable. Some people would say, living in my own skin is become more comfortable with being different. And intellectually, every one of us can assent to that. Of course, I want to be different. Not too different, though. I mean, I want to be different and unique, but I don't want to be that different because those people end up being marginalized. But becoming comfortable with being different and valuing differences just as much as I value similarities in relationships, it is a greater discovery in a lot of relationships when you find the person being honest enough to say, I don't quite see it the same way you do. And quite honestly, I would want your ears to perk up and say, really? Tell me more. I want to understand. Because that's the stuff where depth is. See, exploring the things that make us different from one another creates depth in relations. Similarities don't. I mean, this is low-hanging fruit. But getting into how we see the world differently, that's where depth often comes. So seeing conflict as an opportunity rather than a threat. Now, again, we got to be careful about our definitions of conflict. But we strive to understand instead of maintaining peace. Okay, in the Beatitudes, it talks about blessed are the peacemakers, Makarios, the divine life with God is set aside for the people that quote unquote make peace, but these are people that are not held hostage by conflict, the people that are making peace. So seeking understanding rather than just getting a placid environment to be in. Yes, Ed?
I just have a hard time wrapping my head around seeing conflict as an opportunity. Like that kind of gives it a positive connotation.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never heard someone like be excited.
Why? Why?
Because it's like tension.
Okay. All right. Would it have any history to it at all?
Probably.
Because most of the time, where does the tension come from? It's the anticipation of catastrophe because we've seen that happen. So framing conflict as an opportunity is contaminated by usually our history with conflict, which is with people that also see it as a tremendous threat to the relationship. Now imagine for a moment if you're in a relationship with somebody that sees conflict as an opportunity. Now that doesn't mean, oh goody, we finally get to fight, I can't wait. No, that's not that. But it does mean that they don't shy away from it. They don't go running to the opposite corner trying to say, it's cool, it's fine. We don't need to get into a fight about it. Okay, notice the terms. Notice the terms. So if we frame this a little bit differently, we don't go scurrying for our nearest safe corner, and then we back up a little bit, take a deep breath and say, help me understand where you're coming from here. I don't get it, and it scares me. Or, I feel like I want to run away. See, and suddenly conflict, people's ability to know one another is exponentially created, because notice what I just said a minute ago. If I'm in a relationship with somebody that allows it to exist, and notice the things that I said, help me understand, and what you're saying really scares me, notice all the extra content that comes into the conversation. Because now we're talking about the stuff that I know about, what scares me, your behavior, or whatever, and I'm inviting you to do the same. And that's where resolution can be found. But if we frame things as opposite corners, like we talked about the different styles, whether it's, all or nothing, win, lose, or compromising, or whatever, the key to resolution is always dialogue and self-revelation or vulnerability. And that never enters in when people start having conflict, partly because of our history, partly because of how uncomfortable we start getting. But we have to ask the question, why am I getting so uncomfortable? Because that will interfere with the connection that is potentially here, which is where conflict becomes constructive rather than destructive, which is what our primary reactions are to it. So striving to make this connection in spite of how bad it feels, the tension I might feel, is not easy to do. A lot of times we don't have a cooperating party to do this with us. I get that. I understand that. But we can model lots of things in terms of the conflict with somebody else. I've had this, other groups that I've done over the years, and I've had people get sideways with me because they're mad. I said something they don't like, or we had somebody in the group last spring that had that with me. And the person was adding a bunch of stuff that I just never was saying, but I didn't run away. And the person ended up kind of hunkering back and closing up the doors. My reaction is, come out. I want to understand. You don't have to turn yourself into a fortress. We can have this conversation without any animus or any animosity or anything like that. But see, it's limited then. It's limited by the willingness of the person who's retreated behind the fortress. That conversation's limited to what they are willing to do in trusting me waiting outside the fortress, okay? And that's hard. I get that. I understand that. But we can model and encourage and invite, and that's the extent of what we can do with good boundaries. I can invite somebody to come out. If they don't come out, what am I going to do? I can't go in there and drag them out. That only creates more conflict. But I can be understanding, and I can try to do the best I can with what little information I have. But I still have to invite them into dialogue if I'm going to understand what changes I need to make. That's the point. The point is me owning my responsibility to make the changes I can make. And I can't get that insight without the other person engaging and helping me understand, literally, where they're coming from. Yeah.
I don't really know how to form this question, but when people retreat after conflict, does it look different for each relationship, how you handle that?
After the conflict?
Right. Like inviting them into understanding.
Yeah.
Does timing and engagement in that look different between the relationship?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times it takes more time than the other strategy. That's why we don't like it. But I think the other part of it is, I think inherently we have within us that resolution means one person wins, the other one admits that they didn't, maybe not lose. I don't think we have a standard for what does it look like after, like you're asking, what does it look like after? If we engage it the way we should, what does it look like after? And two people walk away with a deeper understanding of each other. Does it change anything immediately? Not probably. But the next time around it does. And probably when they dialogue again, now they're interacting with a little bit more depth to understand where the person's coming from, how to conduct myself. I may not have the insight of where the person is when they blow a gasket over something. I may not have the insight if I don't have the dialogue with them. And so let's just say, for example, and this plays out in my household because my wife is under tension all the time, teaching remotely really disturbed kids. And so guess what it looks like when I get home. It's kick the spouse time because I am the easiest target. She can't do it to the kids that she's teaching. Now, if I don't have the understanding and I feel attacked, then what am I going to do? I'm going to take it upon myself to fight back. On the other hand, armed with the information that I just described to you, what does that turn into? Probably self-sacrifice and being misunderstood and taking it sounds awful, but taking the hits because it's got to go somewhere. Better it goes to somebody who understands why somebody is lashing out. And I know that if I am able to take those hits, she'll come back around to taking responsibility for herself. And then it's not like, well, that's all good. I've been sliced and diced for the last hour. Well, there's a limit to all of that too. Oftentimes that's happened and I say, hey, back off. I know you're really angry. I ain't the person to be taking this out on. Okay, boundaries. And it usually, sometimes what that does is she kind of goes, like she's coming out of a trance and it's like, oh yeah, you're right. I really shouldn't be doing this. And see, that's what understanding does for us in these relationships. So the seeing the dialogue around our differences as a means of a deeper understanding of the other person, what that translates into is always going to be later. It's not going to be in that moment. Will the two people maybe have some forgiveness and repenting and reconciliation to do? Yeah, probably. But that's a bigger part of the conversation, I think, in terms of kind of restoring the relationship back to a healthy kind of equilibrium. Does that answer your question? Okay, another key is, well, no, those are all my keys. Sorry about that. So I'm going to turn my attention to, freedom from, we looked at that. And in the keys to living freely, it is now freedom to. And the freedom to feel is the first one. It is probably the easiest one to write down and the hardest one to actually make happen. Because in a lot of cases, we are self-evaluating our own emotions in terms of the impact that it has on other people. But I am free to feel and to express those emotions as a free person, that I don't have to apologize for my emotions to other people. I'm free to experience them as they are. And that also includes to be able to have a voice. In a lot of cases, we don't live freely in our relationships because we shut down our voices for one another because of some of the things that we were talking about with conflict and other things like that. And so we're free to have a voice. Probably the vast majority of time I spend talking to people coming through trauma is finding their voice. Because their voice didn't matter before, and now it does. So finding their voice, pursuing right relationships, which is what righteousness means in Scripture with God and others, rejecting formulae, and pursuing process or relationship, and finally the idea of living from the inside out rather than the outside in. Again, all of these things, I have the freedom to do these things. I have the freedom to cultivate this within myself, to live from the inside out. What does that mean? Well, it means I don't always look real clean and well put together and all the other things, because it's a process. It's a part of life and living that I have to engage in. So I'm free to do each one of these things, and then the last ones are kind of the last elements is I am free to love, which includes boundaries. I can't give away that which I don't own. So I'm free to love. I am free to trust, using the discernment that I rightfully have to understand whether or not or who is worthy of my trust, and giving other people the opportunity to choose. And that's where freedom lies for them. I can't make them choose, but I certainly can do everything I can to cultivate the freedom in our relationship to make that happen. And finally, last but not least, is to experience self-acceptance without shame, which is the point of our class, is to move the ball a little farther in terms of what self-acceptance looks like, and how it actually plays out. So being able to feel, to do each one of these things. I don't know if there's another one. Yeah, well, actually there are. There you go. A gift is waiting for you. Freeing to experience forgiveness and forgiveness and forgiveness and forgiving, repenting without shame, learning to live without perfectionism and pursuing excellence is a part of each one of these things, and what we understand around that. And that each one of these, as you know, again, I'm trying to bring together all that we've been across over the semester. There's been a lot, and where we land is the horizon awaits. Somebody looking through pure glass can see the horizon and what it means to be the kind of people that can be known and know other people and be a part of just authentic relationships. So I say it somewhat sarcastically outside the Christmas season, Merry Christmas. Now I get to say it in the season, and Merry Christmas. There's plenty to be thinking about. Are you guys that have Saxby, are you meeting?
Yeah.
You are meeting online? On Zoom. Okay, yeah, we are too. So That's going to be your debrief time for me, the people that are in my group, and with Saxby. Before we close up shop, any other questions, any other thoughts, any other reactions? Perhaps your last paper or last journal actually is an opportunity for you to look back and reflect on some of the things that you've learned and so forth. But anything now as we're together as a class for the last time? All we want to do is survive, right? Okay. Well, we are finished. I will see you all in my group. The rest of you, blessings on your holiday season and everything. And as I usually end, love ya. Later. Bye.